This week, there was a very concerning development on Tuesday, June 23rd. A sentence was handed down to a group of protesters in Texas who had been convicted on terrorism charges and now sentenced to several decades in prison. We're talking about sentences of 30, 50, and 100 years. These protesters had been arrested in July 2025 in the aftermath of a noise demonstration outside the Prairieland Detention Center to express solidarity with the immigrant detainees being held there. As the protest was wrapping up, a federal officer was shot in the shoulder. He survived, but the incident was used by federal prosecutors to allege that the entire thing was a premeditated conspiracy to carry out terrorist actions against the federal agents. That means instead of just arresting the shooter, the U.S. Department of Justice has hatched a conspiracy alleging that the protesters are part of a violent ideological network that it labels Antifa. Evidence to prove this is saying that defendants had zines, they have left-wing politics, they use the app called Signal, they dressed in black, they invoke their rights during an arrest. So this probably sounds familiar if you've ever been to a protest or consider yourself an activist. Progressives and free speech advocates say that the Prairieland case sets a very dangerous precedent of the criminalization of dissent under Donald Trump's NSPM 7, or the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, signed in September 2025. NSPM 7 has essentially codified the treatment of political dissent as a form of domestic terrorism by establishing that views like anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, extremism on immigration are indicators of radical left-wing violence and terrorism. A lot is at stake with this ruling, and today we are very lucky to be joined by Hannah Riley Fernandez, an independent journalist, to talk about the implication of the sentencing this week and why it should concern everyone. So Hannah, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for talking about this.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so you said a lot of good stuff about the length of these sentences, which is pretty terrifying. The combined totals, there were 8 people sentenced, and the total was 450 years. The sentences ranging between 30 years and 100 years. And I want to go back. I know you talked about this a little bit, but just to say what a noise demonstration is for folks who haven't been to one, it is people gathering outside of a facility. They set off fireworks, they play music, they bang on pots and pans. It's a long-standing form of solidarity action that's used specifically because they reach people inside, incarcerated people, folks in detention centers who have no way of knowing that people on the outside are fighting for them. So a noise demo just says, hey, we know you're in there, we haven't forgotten you. And that's what happened outside the Prairieland ICE Detention Center last July 4th. So an important fact, the government is alleging that towards the end of the demonstration, one person, Benjamin Song, who's a Marine Corps veteran and a firearms instructor with a legal firearm, fired a weapon at a responding police officer after watching that officer point his gun at the back of a running unarmed protester. And obviously, we saw in 3 weeks in Minneapolis murders from federal agents killing protesters. So Song said he saw what was going to happen and he acted to prevent it. The officer sustained a non-fatal injury and was released within hours. But here's what happened to other people who attended that noise demonstration. Maricela Rueda attended the protest, left when officers showed up and began to disperse the crowd, had nothing to do with the shot that was fired. She had no weapons. She had no criminal record. The jury acquitted her of every violence-related count. She was sentenced to 70 years. That's 7 decades in federal prison, because she was also convicted, and you mentioned this, of conspiracy to conceal documents, which meant asking her husband to move a box of political literature after her arrest. The husband was not at the protest at all. He was arrested when FBI agents found this box of zines in his car. He was turned over to ICE, jeopardizing his green card status. And he was sentenced to 30 years for moving that box. 5 others were sentenced, convicted of rioting, providing material support to terrorism, conspiracy to use an explosive, and that explosive in question is fireworks that you buy like on the side of the road. They're everywhere. I just drove through New Hampshire. So
Famously.
Exactly. 50 years each for being present at a noise demonstration where someone else fired a weapon.
That's crazy.
And if I can say one more thing of just contextualizing these sentences, the average federal sentence across all crimes in this country is under 6 years. These sentences are considerably longer than any January 6 participants got. I think the head of the Oath Keepers originally had a 22-year sentence, but then was pardoned by Trump. These sentences are more severe than the average federal sentence for murder or rape. So they are, in a country that already has exceptionally long sentences, I was floored, and I was expecting, the worst.
No, it's completely outrageous and shocking, and I think it's meant to be shocking. It's almost like to send a message of some sort, right?
Yes,
absolutely. But one of the major factors, though, in raising the stakes on this case was Trump's NSPM 7. So, can you talk about how this memorandum impacted the Prairieland case and why this is a threat to everyone's rights?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. To understand why these sentences are significant beyond Fort Worth, beyond Texas, you got to go into NSPM 7 and what it does and the critical role that it played in the Prairieland case and in creating the conditions for it. So Trump used the Prairieland case as the first bullet point in a press release announcing his designation of Antifa, which literally just means anti-fascist, as a domestic terrorist organization. This was not about prosecuting what happened on July 4th. It was about creating a predicate, a usable example of quote unquote leftist Antifa violence for a much broader crackdown. So days after that executive order, Trump issued, I think it's National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, NSPM 7, which mandates federal agencies to investigate and disrupt groups that are linked to what it calls left-wing violence, which usually just means leftist organizing. The memo, you touched on this at the beginning, defines the common threads of that violence as anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, along with opposition to the government's immigration policies, and what it calls extremism on race and gender. So again, anti-capitalism is a marker of domestic terrorism under this memo. Opposing immigration enforcement is a marker of domestic terrorism. The memo is legally unmoored. It cites no statutes. It has no constitutional provisions. But I think we know that doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be constitutional to be devastating. And I want to talk a little about the timeline of NSPM 7 with Prairieland. So it was issued after. So these folks were originally arrested on state charges. They were sitting in jail. Then NSPM 7 was issued. They were then indicted federally on Antifa charges. The original state charging document, made no mention of Antifa, of terrorism. That was layered on afterward because NSPM 7 gave prosecutors the framework to do it. So, as you also said, they then convinced a jury that wearing black and using an encrypted messaging app that most people use constituted material support for terrorism. So that's now the precedent that we have in this country. And they've created a joint mission center that draws from different federal agencies to prosecute these targets, which again are leftist organizers. And the FBI is currently training state and local police on this. This isn't some memo that was like issued and is like gathering dust in a corner. Like it's really the operational infrastructure for all of this. And I think talk about this a little more later, but I just want to say the framework is what is so dangerous. It expands criminal liability far beyond anyone who actually committed any act, just like targeting peripheral people through conspiracy charges that don't require any proof of individual criminal conduct. So like prosecutors don't have to prove that you did anything. They just have to prove that you were adjacent to someone who did, that you share certain political values, and that you took an overt act, which can be literally going to a meeting, posting on social media, using Signal as evidence of this like broadly defined conspiracy. And this is being used across the country now. Minneapolis, there's indictments against organizers that specifically cite NSPM 7 for going to meetings and handing out flyers. I believe in Michigan, there's pro-Palestine student protesters who are facing federal charges under this from conduct, I think 3 years ago. And in Atlanta, where I have been for many years, 2 Cop City protesters were federally indicted 2 weeks ago under NSPM 7 for, again, another demonstration that happened outside of the contractor that was working on Cop City from 2022. So this is 4 years old at this point. So, the FBI has been ordered to like revisit all of these old files and find new charges. And that's exactly what has happened. And I expect to see it happening more.
I mean, it's really a concerning development, especially coming from Trump, who allegedly was going to be the defender of free speech, for all Americans, and hitting back against those who try to suppress the rightful patriots from speaking out. But jokes aside, again, you covered, as you mentioned, the movement against Cop City very closely, and the very strong backlash and repression that the movement faced there. A couple years later, repression of dissent and free speech is only intensifying. But at the same time, we are seeing that movements against Trump's immigration policies, against his attacks on workers, and against his foreign policy decisions, whether it be to start the illegal war in Iran, whether it be the legal bombing of Venezuela, or the backing or in the complicity in the genocide against the Palestinian people. And all of these movements have been growing. So why do you think it is that, this repression increases at the time that these movements are growing? And should this be seen, not as a moment of despair, but a moment of hope?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is they're growing precisely because of the repression and also in spite of it. And I think those are like two different dynamics worth separating. The repression is real and it is designed to work. At the courthouse in Fort Worth, folks were asking like, well, if I go to a noise demo, am I not going to come home to my kids? Am I going to be labeled a criminal if I bring like a medic kit to a protest? That's the intended effect. These sentences are designed to produce exactly that fear. But I think here's what the administration, I believe, is miscalculating. They are wielding a system that people already know intimately, and that intimacy is what's driving people into the streets in the first place. The US has the largest incarceration rate in the world. We have militarized our police. We've built a detention infrastructure that holds hundreds of thousands of people at any given moment. And we've really normalized the disappearance of neighbors and family members and loved ones. And I don't mean just, these ICE raids. This is the mass apparatus of incarceration and policing in this country. And these don't happen in the abstract. They happen on specific streets and specific neighborhoods to people that other people know and love. And so the detention centers that protesters were standing outside of on July 4th are places where real people are being held, often for months, cut off from their families and communities. And they're someone's father or neighbor or coworker. And I think the confirmation in the Prairieland case that the state really is willing to do something like sentence, a mother of a 12-year-old to 70 years for fleeing a protest against a concentration camp while pardoning every single person who stormed the Capitol. I don't think that produces submission. I think that produces a clarity of the sort that historically spurs on movements. So the conditions driving people into the streets don't change because of these truly generational prison terms. And yeah, I think Cop City is sort of proof of concept. There was years of extraordinary repression, including the killing of Tortuguita by Georgia police officers in January of 2023, this sprawling RICO prosecution that has since mostly fallen apart. Those things did not successfully end the movement. They nationalized it. And I think the same dynamic is going to play out with Prairieland. Like, movements that are rooted in material conditions don't disappear when governments get brutal. Like, they often deepen. And it's worth saying, these cases aren't over. The Prairieland defendants have motions pending for acquittal, a new trial. Litigators I think have laid out a pretty clear constitutional case against the NSPM 7. My understanding is a lot of the charges in Minnesota have been dropped, similar to what happened in Georgia. But the defendants in Prairieland's loved ones have been very clear that the people of this country will not just accept authoritarian rule. Resistance is deepening and it's generalizing. And that does give me a lot of hope, sort of not in spite of the darkness, but sort of through it.
And then on that note, I do want to ask you, like, in this very scary moment that we're witnessing, what do you think is the responsibility of journalists and media workers?
Great question. I have a lot of thoughts. I would say the first responsibility is to tell the truth about what's happening and to refuse every part of the state's framing. I saw a BBC article just this morning, calling it a riot. Antifa is not an organization. It never was. The government invented a terror cell, prosecuted people for belonging to it, and got convictions. But every time an outlet runs a headline about Antifa or a terrorist attack on an ICE facility, without interrogating those words, it's participating in the government's invention. Journalism that treats the government's messaging as neutral is never neutral. You're just doing the government's work for you. So that's sort of a basic responsibility. I think the second thing that's important is to lay out sort of the proportion and the context. Report these sentences against what January 6ers got, what the average federal sentences are, what the evidence actually was. The story of a woman acquitted of every violence-related charge, receiving 7 decades, of 5 people receiving 50 years for being present at a noise demo, of a man receiving 30 years for moving a box of zines. Like, that's a very different story from one that any governmental press release is going to tell. And journalists absolutely have the responsibility to say what this is, which is the use of the federal court system to imprison people for their political beliefs. I mean, there is no spin to that. Those are the facts. I think it's also important to cover the pattern, not just the individual cases. So Michigan, Minneapolis, Cop City, Prairieland, these are not isolated stories. They're a documented, named operational initiative with like a ton of federal agencies heft behind it. So I think NSPM 7 as an infrastructure for political prosecution is a much more important story than any individual indictment. And it would be great to see more outlets covering it like that. When you zoom out and you see the full picture, which is the FBI revisiting these things from 3 years ago, conspiracy charges adding to people who went to a meeting, terrorism charges for fireworks. Like, we're looking at a systematic effort to make political dissent legally untenable in the United States. And that is a 5-alarm fire for democracy, and it has to be covered like one.
Yeah, well, Hannah Riley Fernandez, thank you so much for breaking all of this down for us. We will definitely be returning to this story and hope to hear more from you on this. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for covering it.